She was never meant to stand out, just a quiet 12-year-old wandering through the dusty backstreets of Elmage, gripping a wrinkled paper bag of leftover bread and the leash of a stray German shepherd whose ears were torn and eyes weary. People passed her without a glance. Nobody knew her name, not until the night a single scream, a flickering beam of light, and the deep growl of a dog changed everything. What she stumbled upon wasn't a lost wallet or an injured cat. She found 3 United States Marines, beaten, bound, and abandoned in the shadows to die. What followed wasn't vengeance. It was something far greater, something divine. This isn't just a story of survival. It's about a child who believed when no one else would. About a dog who fought like he remembered the soul he was saving. And about a God who still works through small hands and paw prints. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe that God still sends angels wrapped in fur and loyalty, hit subscribe, because this story won't just stay with you, it might change you. The wind whispered low through the narrow streets of Elmage, a quiet desert town resting beneath the faded skies of New Mexico. It was late autumn. The days still burned beneath the sun, but the nights turned cool enough to make the air bite at your skin. The sky was bruised purple at dusk, hanging heavy over cracked sidewalks and fading neon signs that buzzed like tired memories. Most of the town had gone still. The occasional pickup truck rumbled by, or a shopkeeper turned the last key in a door, calling it a night. Emily Carter, small and wiry like a reed in the wind, tugged her hoodie closer around her shoulders. The fabric had seen better days, its cuffs frayed and its blue color long since washed to gray. Strands of sun-bleached brown hair peeked out from beneath her hood, curling at the edges. Her large gray eyes missed nothing. There was a quiet intelligence in them, not the kind that comes from books, but from learning too early how to watch and wait. She'd grown up surrounded by silence, the kind that settles in homes where one parent works too much and the other stopped being mentioned long ago. Her mother, Sarah Carter, did her best, double shifts, endless worry, and quiet strength. The kind of woman who never stopped moving even when exhaustion whispered that she should. At Emily's side walked Shadow, a German shepherd with a sable coat faded from sun and age. He was a large dog, nearly 90 pounds of quiet muscle, one ear torn from an old fight, eyes sharp as amber glass. He carried himself with the alert stillness of something that had been hurt once and decided it would never happen again. Emily had found him 3 years earlier behind the old diner, hungry, limping, and too proud to accept help. She had sat there for hours, whispering soft nonsense until he let her stay close. From that moment, they'd been inseparable. Tonight, the two of them moved together down Elmage's east side, quiet, almost invisible. Emily held a small flashlight in one hand and a crumpled bag in the other, headed toward Miss Hilda's corner shop 5 blocks away. Miss Hilda, a kind woman with sweaters far too big and a voice that always called people darling. She kept stray cats behind her store and stale bread for the ones with hungry eyes. Emily's mother didn't like her walking alone after dark, but the fridge was empty again, and morning would come with little more than tap water if she didn't go. Sarah Carter had stood in the doorway earlier, apron still tied from her diner shift, and said, "Be careful, Em." She tried to sound calm, but fear always leaked through. Then she'd locked the door behind her daughter and exhaled the kind of prayer only mothers know. Now the streetlights buzzed faintly overhead as Emily and Shadow passed shuttered windows and fences rattling in the wind. Across the street, a few teenagers sat on the hood of a rusted sedan, laughing too loudly. Emily ignored them. Shadow didn't, his gaze fixed, ears twitching, muscles tight beneath his coat. The air smelled like fried oil, gasoline, and the faint metallic tang of rain that would never come. Then, a sound. Emily froze. A grunt. Then a heavy thud. Shadow stopped too, lowering his head, his body tensed like a drawn bow. The noise came from the alley behind Cactus Pawn and Gun, a place where shadows stacked like smoke. Another sound followed, a moan, low and ragged. Her mother's words rang in her head. "Stick to the main streets, keep your head down. But the moan came again, sharper this time. A voice, broken by pain. And it wasn't alone. Emily's hand trembled as she clicked on the flashlight. The weak beam cut into the black. She took one hesitant step forward. Then another. Shadow growled deep in his chest, his whole body quivering, ready. The light found them, 3 men slumped against the alley wall, wrists bound with coarse rope, faces swollen and bloodied. Their uniforms, tattered but clear enough, bore the faded marks of the United States Marines. Standing over them was a 4th figure, tall, broad, and dangerous. A man in a black jacket with a faded insignia on the shoulder. His face was half hidden by a balaclava. Steel-toed boots slammed into one of the soldier's ribs with a crack. Emily gasped. The man turned. Cold eyes met hers, shock flashing to fury. "Get out of here, kid," he barked, stepping forward. Shadow lunged in front of Emily, barking so fiercely the sound tore through the alley like thunder. His teeth glinted, his hackles rose. The man flinched, raising an arm to shield his face. "Leave them alone," Emily shouted, her voice cracking but steady. She aimed the flashlight straight at him. He cursed, recoiling from the glare. Something glimmered in his hand, maybe a knife. Emily screamed again, louder this time. "Help! Somebody help!" From down the block, voices stirred, the teens by the car, startled, murmuring. The attacker's head whipped toward the noise. Then, with a snarl, he turned and bolted down the far end of the alley, swallowed by the dark. Emily ran forward, dropping to her knees beside the nearest man. Shadow stayed beside her, his growls still vibrating low. "Sir," she whispered, reaching for his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" The man groaned, eyelids fluttering open. His skin was pale beneath the dirt, his lips split and dry. "You're safe now," she said quickly, though her voice shook. "I'm getting help, just hold on." Far away, a siren began to wail. It grew louder, bouncing between the walls of the alley until red and blue lights washed over the cracked bricks. Emily fumbled for her phone, hands trembling, nearly dropping it before pressing the numbers. 3 men, hurt, tied up, please hurry, she managed to stammer out before the call ended. Her flashlight flickered again, dying slowly. Shadow stood beside her, silent now, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the shadows beyond. The scent of blood, sweat, and dust filled the night. And for the first time, Emily Carter realized the world she thought she knew had just shifted forever. The alley pulsed with red and blue light as sirens wailed louder, echoing off the walls like the heartbeat of the town itself. Emily knelt beside the unconscious Marines, her small hands trembling as she pressed them against the rough concrete. Shadow stayed close, the deep rumble in his chest never fading. A police cruiser screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley. 2 officers stepped out, their flashlights slicing through the dust. One was a broad man in his 40s with cropped blonde hair and the steady movements of someone who'd seen too much but still cared, Officer Darnell Brooks. The other, younger, with auburn curls escaping her hat, was Officer Rivera. Brooks took one look at the scene and cursed softly under his breath. "We need medics, now," he said into his radio. 3 down, multiple injuries, possible internal bleeding. Rivera crouched beside Emily, her voice gentle. "Hey, sweetheart, you called this in?" Emily nodded, her voice barely a whisper. They were tied up. He was hurting them. Then he ran. Rivera placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did good. Stay right here, okay?" But Emily wasn't going anywhere. She turned back to the Marines, flashlight trembling in her hand as she tried to check if they were breathing. The first man, tall, square-jawed, streaks of gray at his temples, wore a name tag that read Reed. His face was swollen, his lips cracked, his breathing shallow. Even in pain, his expression carried the unmistakable discipline of a soldier. To his left lay another Marine, lean, with darker skin and a scar running along his cheekbone. His uniform was torn at the shoulder, blood darkening the sleeve. His name tag read Price. The third was the youngest, barely older than Emily's cousins, his face still soft under the bruises. Clark, the tag read. His chest rose and fell in short, panicked bursts. Emily's throat tightened. "They're still alive," she said quickly, looking up at Officer Brooks. "Please hurry." "We're on it," Brooks said, waving the EMTs closer as the ambulance pulled up. Two medics rushed out, one, a tall woman with freckles and black hair braided down her back, the other, a stocky man with kind eyes. Their uniforms bore the navy blue crest of the regional trauma team. The woman, Teresa Nguyen, knelt beside Reed, her movements efficient but tender. "Pulse weak," she called out. "Get oxygen here." The man, Marcus Hall, began cutting through the ropes binding the Marines. The coarse fibers snapped with a soft twang. Emily stayed on her knees, watching in silence. Shadow didn't move an inch, standing guard as though daring anyone to come too close. When Teresa slipped an oxygen mask over Sergeant Reed's mouth, his eyelids fluttered. Emily leaned in close. "You're okay now," she whispered, not sure if he could hear. "We found you. Don't go." His fingers twitched faintly against hers. Rivera moved closer, speaking softly. "Honey, you should come with me, let the medics do their job." Emily shook her head. "Not until I know they're safe." Rivera hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You're braver than most adults I've met." Minutes later, the Marines were lifted onto stretchers. Mason Reed's hand brushed against Emily's as they wheeled him past. It wasn't much, just a small, unconscious movement, but something in it made Emily exhale for the first time in minutes. The ambulances roared off into the distance, sirens fading. Emily sank down on the curb, drained. Shadow pressed his head onto her knee, his warm breath grounding her to the earth. "You did good, boy," she whispered shakily. "You stayed." By the time morning came, Elmage looked like a different town. The sterile white light of St. Elmo's Regional Hospital hummed against polished floors and walls lined with family photos and old motivational posters. The faint smell of disinfectant clung to everything. Emily sat in a chair that felt too big for her, hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands, twisting the fabric as if it could quiet the tremor in her fingers. Beside her sat her mother, Sarah Carter, tall, lean, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. Sarah's hair was tied in its usual bun, though loose strands framed her face. She wore her diner uniform under a denim jacket, the name tag still pinned crookedly at her chest. She'd been at work when the police showed up, apron still on, barely able to breathe as they told her what her daughter had done. She'd cried, then held Emily so tight the girl could barely breathe. But now, as they sat waiting for news, worry had crept back in like a cold draft. A nurse stepped into the waiting area, petite, with kind eyes behind square glasses and a name tag that read Debbie Sloan. "Miss Carter," she said softly. Sarah stood at once, her hand instinctively resting on Emily's shoulder. "They're stable," Nurse Sloan said with a small smile. "All 3 Marines. It was close, but they're going to make it." Sarah exhaled sharply, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. Emily's eyes widened. "Can we see them?" "One of them's awake," the nurse said, her smile deepening. "Sergeant Mason Reed." He asked for the little girl with the German shepherd. Emily's cheeks flushed. "That's me," she whispered. "Then follow me," Sloan said. Shadow padded beside them down a corridor lined with pale blue walls and the rhythmic beep of distant monitors. Nurses passed quietly, their shoes squeaking on polished tile. When they entered the recovery room, it was dim but peaceful, a single lamp glowing beside the bed. Mason Reed lay propped up, his right arm in a sling, for lines trailing from his hand. His face was bruised, a patch of hair shaved near the stitches at his temple. But his eyes, dark, steady, and alive, softened when they landed on Emily. "You're here," he murmured hoarsely. Emily hesitated by the doorway, unsure. Shadow moved first, padding toward the bed. He placed his paws gently on the edge and nudged Mason's hand. "Hey, big guy," Mason said with a weary smile. "You're even taller up close." Shadow leaned forward, and with a wet, unapologetic swipe, licked his cheek. Mason chuckled, then winced. "Ow. Worth it." Sarah laughed quietly for the first time that day. Nurse Sloane covered her mouth to hide her grin. "Sorry," Emily said, embarrassed. He shows affection like that." "No," Mason said, shaking his head. "He's perfect. Both of you are." He looked at her closely now, really looked. The small girl who had run toward danger instead of away from it. The one who refused to let fear dictate her heart. "Come sit," he said softly, motioning to the chair beside him. Emily obeyed, perching at his side while Sarah remained by the door. "I don't remember much," Mason admitted, his voice gravelly. "Just the cold, and then light. A voice. And barking." Emily glanced down at Shadow, who now lay with his chin resting on her foot, eyes half closed but alert. "I thought we were gone," Mason continued. "If it wasn't for you two," he trailed off, emotion tightening his throat. "You saved us, Emily. Me and my brothers." Emily swallowed hard, her lip trembling. "I just heard someone hurting." "That's what makes you brave," he said. "You didn't think twice." Before she could answer, the door opened again. Two other Marines entered, Corporal Logan Price and Private Jaden Clark, both in hospital gowns, moving carefully. Logan's arm was in a sling, his face stitched along the cheekbone. "That her?" he rasped. "That's her," Mason said. Jaden smiled shyly, leaning on a crutch. "Hey. I'm Jaden. You really scared that guy off, huh?" Emily blushed. Shadow helped. "Good soldier," Logan said, crouching to pet the dog. Shadow gave a short, proud bark, tail wagging once. The small hospital room filled with quiet laughter, the sound of something broken beginning to heal. Outside, morning light streamed through the blinds, painting soft gold lines across the floor, the first rays over Elmich that felt like hope. The late afternoon sun cast warm light over the desert hills beyond Elmich. The air carried the scent of sagebrush and distant barbecue smoke drifting from the military base. At Camp Wilcox, rows of barracks gleamed in pale tan and gray, their shadows stretching across gravel courtyards and chain-link fences. Despite its rugged appearance, the base held a sense of calm that felt almost sacred after everything that had happened. Sergeant Mason Reed stood in the small garden courtyard tucked between two training buildings, a bouquet of wildflowers gripped awkwardly in his good hand. His uniform was crisp, the Marine Corps pin on his chest shining against the sunlight. Though his left arm remained in a sling and bruises still marred his jaw, he carried himself with renewed steadiness, the poise of a man piecing his strength back together. When he heard footsteps, Mason turned and smiled. Walking toward him was Emily Carter, hand in hand with her mother. Emily wore a denim skirt and a faded blue t-shirt with small sunflowers printed across it. Her brown hair had been brushed neatly, though a few curls still escaped around her temples. At her side, Shadow trotted proudly, freshly bathed, a red bandana tied around his neck. Sarah Carter followed just behind, composed but wary. She wore a soft blouse and black slacks, her hair loose for once, cascading in gentle waves down her shoulders. Her posture was careful, protective, every step measured. Mason's smile widened. "You made it." Emily grinned back. "Hi, Sergeant Mason." "Just Mason today," he said warmly. "This isn't official business. We're just friends having lunch." He extended the bouquet toward her. "These are for you." Emily's eyes brightened. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he replied simply. They walked together toward a picnic table shaded by a small awning. Two younger Marines were already setting things up, Corporal Riley Nguyen, a tall woman in her late 20s with a sharp braid down her back, and Specialist Mike Bennett, a stocky, freckled mechanic with a permanent smudge of grease on his fingers. "Ma'am," Riley greeted Sarah politely, nodding. "It's an honor to have you both here." Mike grinned down at Shadow. "And there's the real hero." He bent to ruffle the dog's ears, earning a low, pleased huff in response. Lunch was simple: grilled chicken, coleslaw, warm rolls, and a pie that Mason swore was baked by a Marine mess cook with secret bakery ambitions. They ate under the sun-dappled shade of the courtyard, laughter gradually replacing the stiffness that had first filled the air. Emily talked about her love for animals and her dream of becoming a veterinarian. She told them about the time she rescued a three-legged cat from a storm drain, and how she and Shadow once tried to herd a runaway goat back to its farm. Mason listened with genuine interest, asking questions, smiling often. It was the kind of easy conversation that made Sarah relax, the kind that made her remember what peace felt like. For the first time in months, she saw her daughter laughing without fear. When dessert plates were cleared, Mason stood, cleared his throat, and gave a small nod to Riley. She stepped away, returning moments later carrying a small wooden box. Mason set it gently in front of Emily. "What's this?" she asked curiously. "Something from all of us," Mason said. Emily lifted the lid, and gasped. Inside rested a silver Marine K9 medallion, etched with the eagle and globe. Below it lay a small ribbon and a brass nameplate engraved with a single word, Shadow. "He saved lives," Mason said softly. "We figured it was time someone gave him a uniform too." Tears glimmered in Emily's eyes as she bent down and hugged Shadow around his neck. The German shepherd gave a single proud bark, and everyone clapped. Laughter and applause filled the courtyard, until a voice cut through it. "Sergeant Reed." A tall man approached from the edge of the garden, lean, sharp-featured, with thin glasses and a clipboard tucked under one arm. "Lieutenant Armand Delgado." His expression was grave. Mason immediately straightened. "Sir." Delgado didn't waste words. "You need to see this." He handed Mason a manila folder. Mason opened it, eyes scanning the papers inside. His expression hardened. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her instincts rising. Delgado glanced at Mason, who gave a small nod to allow him to explain. "There was a break-in last night," Delgado said evenly. "At your apartment, Sergeant." Sarah's stomach dropped. Emily froze. Delgado continued, his tone clipped. "It was targeted. The door wasn't forced, they used a key. Nothing was stolen." He placed a photograph from the folder on the table. It showed a piece of paper scrawled in thick black marker. "Keep quiet or else." Sarah went pale, her hand instinctively pulling Emily close. Delgado added quietly, "We've launched an investigation. But this changes things." Emily's small fists clenched. Shadow stood abruptly, tail stiff, his body tense, ears back. He sensed the shift long before anyone spoke. Mason reached out, placing his hand gently on Emily's shoulder. "You're safe here. We'll figure this out. But you both need to stay on base tonight." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Agreed." The light of day began to fade, long shadows stretching across the sand. And though laughter had filled the courtyard only moments earlier, the silence that followed carried a new weight, the unmistakable sense that danger hadn't disappeared. It had only gotten closer. By evening, the warm glow of the setting sun had vanished behind the hills, leaving Camp Wilcox in muted tones of amber and blue. The northern side of the base, the secure housing quarters, looked almost peaceful, rows of uniform buildings painted in desert beige with cacti-lined paths. But peace was only surface deep. Inside one of those apartments, Sarah Carter couldn't rest. She sat curled on the small couch, a chipped mug of tea in her hands, her eyes locked on the door. The room had been made comfortable for her and Emily, simple, clean, and safe, but no amount of comfort could quiet the unease pressing in around her heart. Through the cracked bedroom door, she could see Emily sitting cross-legged on the bed, tracing her finger along the stitching of the quilt. The room was small but cozy, a few library books stacked on the shelf, a framed picture someone had taken at the courtyard lunch, Emily, Mason, and Shadow smiling in the sun. Shadow lay at the foot of the bed, his body relaxed but his ears always twitching, his instincts refusing to rest. 2 days had passed since the break-in. Delgado had returned that morning, carrying files and questions. He was a man of precision, his voice even and controlled, but beneath the military formality there was something more personal, loyalty. He and Mason had served together, and this case had touched a nerve. He'd laid out photos on the table, coded notes, shipment records, faces of men who shouldn't have been anywhere near Elmage. This wasn't random, Delgado had said quietly. They wanted leverage. Sarah's jaw had tightened. Because my daughter helped them? Delgado nodded. Because she got in the way. Now, as the desert wind brushed softly against the window screens, that warning echoed in Sarah's mind. She watched her daughter through the doorway. Emily had been brave beyond measure, but bravery had a cost. The nightmares had started 2 nights ago. Each time she woke up gasping, Shadow was already there, pressing his head against her arm until she calmed. Tonight, Sarah stayed awake long after Emily drifted to sleep, staring at the quiet room, wondering how close the danger truly was. Outside, the night stretched across the desert like a blanket of silence, the kind that feels almost too still. Somewhere in the dark, a lone coyote called out. Shadow's ears flicked, and his eyes opened. He didn't move. He just watched the door. Waiting. The desert morning arrived bright and windless. From the outside, Camp Wilcox looked like any quiet military base, soldiers running drills in the distance, flags rippling against a clear sky, and sunlight spilling over the concrete paths. But inside one small apartment near the north fence line, something felt off. Emily Carter sat on the couch, knees tucked up under her chin, flipping through a worn library book about wolves. She liked them, not because they were fierce, but because they stayed loyal to their pack. Shadow lay sprawled beside her, his big head resting on his paws, eyes following every move she made. Across the room, Sarah Carter stood by the counter, half listening to the low hum of the refrigerator while reviewing a note Lieutenant Delgado had left that morning, an update about the investigation. The suspect's handwriting matched the threat from the break-in. They believed it was connected to a smuggling network Mason Reed and his unit had been tracking before the ambush. Sarah had read the words 3 times but couldn't stop the chill that crawled up her spine. She set the note down and poured herself another cup of coffee. "You doing okay, kiddo?" she asked softly. Emily nodded, not looking up. "Yeah. Just tired. Try to rest." "You've had enough excitement for a lifetime," Sarah said, forcing a small smile. Emily closed her book and reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ear. "He's not tired," she said quietly. "He's listening." Shadow's ear twitched in agreement, and Sarah exhaled, half amused, half worried. That afternoon, Sarah had to meet Delgado for another briefing. "I won't be long," she promised, smoothing Emily's hair back. "Lock the door. No visitors." Emily nodded dutifully. "Yes, ma'am." Shadow barked once, almost as if confirming the order. When the door clicked shut behind her mother, Emily wandered into the small kitchenette. The room was filled with golden light pouring through the blinds. On the counter, Sarah's old cell phone buzzed suddenly, the vibration sharp against the laminate surface. Emily frowned. The screen flashed a familiar name. Miss Hilda. Her heart lifted. Miss Hilda, the kind old shopkeeper from the corner store, with her 2 big sweaters and bags of leftover bread. The woman who always called her darling. Emily swiped to answer. "Hello." The voice on the other end was raspy, strained. "Emily, dear, thank goodness." "Miss Hilda?" Emily asked quickly. "Are you okay?" I fell," the woman gasped. "Behind the shop. My leg. I think it's broken. I can't move." Emily's eyes widened. "Did you call an ambulance?" "I tried," came the trembling reply, "but my phone's dying. You were the only number I could reach. Please, sweetheart, come quick. I'm right behind the alley. Don't tell your mama, she's been through enough." Then the line went dead. Emily stared at the phone, frozen. The silence that followed was heavy and strange. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Emily looked at him. "She needs help," she said softly. Shadow growled again, louder this time. His tail stiffened, body rigid. "What's wrong?" Emily whispered. "It's just Miss Hilda." The dog stepped in front of the door, blocking her path. "Shadow, move," she said gently. "Please." He barked, sharp, commanding, the sound echoing in the small room. His eyes, dark and pleading, told her something her heart didn't want to hear. But compassion overrode instinct. "She's hurt," Emily insisted. "I'll be right back." She slipped past him, grabbing her hoodie and slipping out the door before he could stop her. Shadow lunged forward, whining, scratching at the door. He rushed to the window just in time to see her jogging toward the gate. His bark thundered through the quiet hallway. Outside the fence, the world looked calm, the kind of calm that hides teeth. The sunlight gleamed on the asphalt. A white van sat idling near the alleyway. Emily didn't notice the shadow moving behind the tinted window. She disappeared around the corner. Shadow barked again, twice, desperate and low, then bolted for the door. His claws scraped against the tile as he threw his weight against the handle. The latch rattled but held. He barked, louder this time, until a guard outside the unit came running. "What's wrong, boy?" the soldier asked, startled. Shadow backed up, then charged again, slamming his body against the door. The man hesitated, then unlocked it. The moment the door opened, Shadow exploded through the gap, sprinting full speed down the corridor, nose to the ground, following her scent like a lifeline. Meanwhile, in the van, Emily's world had turned dark. The air was thick with gasoline and sweat. Her wrists were bound behind her with zip ties that bit deep into her skin. A gag had been shoved roughly between her teeth, but she'd managed to loosen it. The man across from her sat hunched, arms resting on his knees. His face was hard and hollow, with slicked back hair tied into a short ponytail. She recognized him, the same man from the alley. Dylan Hart. He didn't speak. He just watched her in silence, his jaw clenching, his breath slow and deliberate. Beside him sat another man, younger, thin, jittery, his cap pulled low, sunglasses hiding his eyes. His fingers drummed nervously against the steering wheel. "Why'd we take the kid?" he muttered. "She's just a kid, man." Dylan's voice was gravel. "Orders." The van jolted as it left the pavement and turned onto gravel. Dust swirled around them as the vehicle slowed and came to a stop. Dylan opened the back doors. "Out," he barked. Emily stumbled forward, knees hitting the hard ground. Her ankle twisted painfully, but she forced herself to stand. Before her loomed an abandoned warehouse, rust streaking its metal sides, broken windows gaping like dark eyes. They dragged her inside. The air was stale and damp, carrying the smell of old oil and rotting wood. Faint beams of light streamed through holes in the roof, striping the floor with silver. They tied her to a metal chair in the center of the room, rope scratching at her arms and chest. She tried not to cry, tried to remember what her mother always said, "Stay calm. Think." As Dylan turned away, she shifted slightly, using her fingers to nudge something from her pocket, a small metal keychain. The one Mason had given her, engraved with Shadow's name. She slipped it between the ropes, wedging it tight against her thigh. If he found it, he might throw it away. But if Shadow found it, he'd know. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the dry rattle of the desert. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried out over the open sky. Back at Camp Wilcox, the alarm was already spreading. Sarah returned from her debriefing to find the door unlocked, the room empty. Shadow was gone. The phone lay on the counter, the call history showing only one outgoing number. Her chest went cold. "Emily?" she shouted, running from room to room. No answer. Moments later, Shadow burst through the main gate, barking furiously, leading a pair of startled MPs toward the perimeter road. "Follow him!" Sarah yelled, racing barefoot after them. Within minutes, Lieutenant Delgado arrived, tablet in hand, pulling up street surveillance. "She wouldn't just leave," Sarah gasped. "She didn't," Delgado said grimly. "Someone lured her out. The number that called was spoofed, matched an old contact. We're tracing it now." He turned toward the barking German shepherd pacing near the gate. "That dog might be our best chance." Shadow barked once, sharp and certain, and took off down the dirt road, nose to the ground, tail cutting through the air like a compass needle locked on one destination. Somewhere ahead, Emily Carter was fighting to stay brave. And Shadow, God's four-legged angel, was already on his way to bring her home. The desert wind howled through the broken highway signs as the sun dipped low behind the ridges. Shadows stretched long and thin across the ground, fitting for the dog named Shadow, who now tore down Highway 9 like a streak of fury and instinct. His paws slammed against the dirt, each stride powerful and certain. His nose tracked the faint, mingled scent of gasoline, old bread, and Emily's fear. Behind him, a military jeep bounced along the road, trying to keep pace. Inside the vehicle sat Sergeant Mason Reed and Lieutenant Delgado, both tense, both silent. Delgado gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes darting between the winding dirt road and the figure of the German shepherd sprinting ahead. "He's leading us straight to her," Mason said, voice rough, body rigid with adrenaline. Delgado nodded grimly. "Let's hope we're not too late." In the warehouse, Emily's wrists burned from the ropes. She'd been sitting there for hours, or maybe it was only minutes. The dim light from a single hanging bulb swung back and forth, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Dylan Hart paced in slow circles, his boots crunching against bits of shattered wood. His partner, the jittery young man, leaned against the wall near the entrance, chewing nervously on his fingernail. "She's just a kid," the younger man muttered again. "You don't have to hurt her." Dylan didn't answer. His jaw tightened as he glared at Emily. "You shouldn't have seen what you did," he said, voice low. "Could have walked by. Could have pretended you didn't hear anything. But no, you had to play hero." Emily stared back at him, eyes wide but steady. She didn't speak. He crouched in front of her, his breath sour, his voice almost a growl. "You think you saved those Marines? You didn't. You just made enemies you don't understand." Emily didn't flinch, though her heart raced so loud she could barely hear herself think. Behind him, the younger man's phone buzzed. He checked the screen and frowned. "They're on to us," he said. "Base patrols have a trace. We gotta move, man." "Not yet," Dylan snapped. "We send a message first." He stood, pacing toward the table near the wall where a gun lay half-hidden beneath a tarp. Emily's breath caught, panic flashing across her face. Then, faint at first, she heard it. A bark. Distant, but real. Her heart jumped. Shadow. Outside, Delgado's convoy slowed to a crawl. The headlights from 3 vehicles illuminated the cracked asphalt and the long stretch of rusted warehouses near the train tracks. Shadow darted ahead, nose to the ground, then suddenly stopped. He barked sharply and looked back at Mason. This is it, Mason said. She's in there. Delgado grabbed his radio. All units, hold perimeter. Go silent. They killed the lights. The vehicles dimmed, replaced by the faint red glow of tactical flashlights. Shadow crouched low, sniffing the wind. His ears twitched once. Then he bolted toward a side entrance, squeezing through a narrow gap between two metal panels. Mason followed, sidearm drawn, Delgado close behind. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of shadows and dust. The smell of oil and rot clung to the air. Shadow moved like smoke, silent but focused. Every nerve in his body knew exactly where Emily was. Emily had begun sawing at the ropes behind her using the sharp edge of her small metal keychain, the one engraved with Shadow. The rope fibers cut her skin, but she didn't stop. Dylan's back was turned, his attention on the weapon. Her fingers worked faster. The rope frayed, strands snapping one by one. Then came the crash, sudden, violent, deafening. The warehouse door burst open. A blur of fur and fury shot through the gap. Shadow slammed into Dylan with the force of a cannonball, knocking him clean off his feet. The man shouted, twisting, trying to grab the knife from his belt. But Shadow was faster. His teeth sank deep into Dylan's jacket sleeve, tearing through the fabric. The younger man screamed, bolting for the exit, only to be met by Delgado and two armed soldiers bursting in from the side door. Hands where I can see them. Delgado shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Dylan struggled beneath Shadow's weight, snarling. He grabbed a nearby pipe and swung, connecting once, hard, against the dog's flank. Shadow yelped but didn't back down. He lunged again, clamping his jaws on Dylan's arm, refusing to let go. Get him off me. Dylan roared, thrashing wildly. Then Mason was there, limping but unyielding, his pistol raised. Drop it. For a moment, the world froze. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by thin shafts of light. Dylan's breath came in ragged gasps. His gaze flicked between Mason's gun and the snarling dog pinning him down. Mason's voice hardened. Drop it, or I swear, you won't get another warning. Something in Mason's tone broke through. Dylan's hand opened. The pipe clattered to the ground. Mason moved forward, cuffing him with his good hand, ignoring the fresh sting in his shoulder. It's over. Behind him, Shadow turned immediately toward the sound of a soft cry. Shadow, Emily whispered, half sobbing, half laughing. The dog bounded across the floor, sliding to a stop beside her chair. He nudged her face with his nose, whining frantically as she used the jagged metal edge to finish sawing through the rope. Good boy, she gasped, hugging his neck the second her hands were free. You found me. Her tears streaked across his fur as his tail thumped weakly against the floor. Mason hurried over, kneeling beside her. You okay? He asked gently. Emily nodded, still shaking. He came for me. Of course he did, Mason said softly. That's what heroes do. Outside, the sound of sirens grew louder as more units arrived. Delgado's voice crackled through the radio, confirming the arrests. Suspects in custody. The girl's safe. Mason helped Emily to her feet. His shoulder burned, blood seeping through his sleeve, but he ignored it. Shadow stayed pressed against Emily's leg, protective even now, his eyes scanning the room until every movement had stopped. The soldiers escorted Dylan and his accomplice out of the warehouse, their heads bowed under the flashing lights. Inside, Emily stood in the middle of the chaos, trembling but unbroken. She looked up at Mason, voice small. Are we really safe now? Mason exhaled slowly. We will be. Then, as if on cue, the first rays of dawn began to push through the cracks in the corrugated roof, thin beams of pale gold cutting through the dark. Emily reached down, running her fingers through Shadow's fur. We're going home, she whispered. The dog gave a quiet, tired bark, as if he already knew. Outside, Delgado spoke quietly to Mason as medics checked Emily over. We found evidence in the back office, emails, maps, encrypted files. You didn't just save a girl tonight. You broke their entire operation. Mason nodded wearily. Couldn't have done it without her. Delgado smiled faintly. Or that dog. Mason looked toward Emily, who sat wrapped in a blanket on the back of the ambulance, Shadow's head in her lap. She looked up and met his gaze. The corners of her mouth lifted, not in joy, but in quiet relief. For the first time in a long while, Mason felt the ache in his chest ease. He holstered his weapon, took one last look at the fading red and blue lights, and whispered under his breath, "Good work, soldier." Shadow thumped his tail in reply. The warehouse was still vibrating with echoes of chaos, the clang of metal, the barked orders of officers, the rasp of radios breaking the silence. Outside, the red and blue lights of police cruisers painted the walls like a heartbeat pulsing against rusted steel. Inside, the air smelled of blood and smoke and dust, the kind of air that carried stories of violence, but also of victory. Sergeant Mason Reed stood near the open door, one arm clutched tight against his bleeding shoulder. The adrenaline that had kept him standing was beginning to fade, replaced by the deep, dull ache of injury. But his focus wasn't on himself. It was on the small figure huddled near the metal chair in the center of the room, Emily Carter. She sat on the floor, her knees pulled close, face streaked with dirt and tears. Shadow stayed beside her, chest rising and falling in quick rhythm, his fur matted with dust and streaks of blood that weren't his own. The dog's growl had quieted to a soft whine, but his gaze never left Emily. Mason took a slow step forward. "Emily," he said, his voice rough but steady. "You're safe now." Her wide gray eyes flicked up to him, uncertain at first, then softening when she recognized the voice. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she pushed herself up and ran straight into his arms. The motion jolted his shoulder, pain flaring white-hot, but Mason didn't flinch. He dropped to one knee, wrapping his good arm around her, holding her close as she sobbed into his chest. Shadow circled once, pressing his head between them as if to make sure neither would ever be apart again. Behind them, Lieutenant Delgado entered with a team of soldiers. His face was stone-cold serious, eyes sweeping the warehouse as other officers secured the perimeter. Two men were already being led out in cuffs, Dylan Hart and his younger accomplice. Delgado's attention, however, snagged on one of the newly detained suspects near the far wall, a lean, blond man in civilian clothes, his wrists zip-tied, a bruise forming above one eye. Delgado froze. Recognition flickered across his face. "Clint Rowe," he muttered. Mason's head snapped up at the name. "You've got to be kidding me." Rowe smirked faintly despite the blood on his lip. "Hey, Sarge. Long time no see." Mason's jaw tightened. "You were with us in Kandahar." "Yeah," Rowe said coolly. "Until I realized loyalty doesn't pay the bills." Delgado stepped forward. "You sold out your own. You helped set this up." Rowe's smile faltered. "You wouldn't understand, sir. Some of us got tired of following orders that lead nowhere." Mason took a step closer, pain forgotten. "You used to be better than this." Rowe shrugged, his tone almost mocking. "Guess you were wrong about me." Delgado motioned to two MPs, "Get him out of my sight." As they dragged Rowe away, Delgado turned back to Mason, his expression grim. "We found computers and communication gear in the back office, encrypted files, location logs. Looks like these guys were running intel through the town. You just saved a lot of people from getting hurt." Mason nodded faintly, then looked down at Emily. She had quieted in his arms, her breathing slowing as the adrenaline drained from her system. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked softly. She nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "You're bleeding," she whispered. Mason smiled, trying to sound casual. "Just a scratch." Shadow gave a low huff, as if disagreeing. Moments later, the medics rushed in with stretchers. The noise of boots and orders filled the space again, but Emily barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to the faces she trusted, Mason, Delgado, and the loyal Shadow beside her. Then, through the blur of lights and movement, a familiar voice broke through. Emily. Sarah Carter's voice was sharp, panicked, alive. She pushed through the line of soldiers, her hair loose, her blouse wrinkled, her shoes half untied from running. Her eyes locked on her daughter, and in an instant, all distance between them disappeared. Emily turned just in time for her mother to fall to her knees and wrap her in a fierce embrace. "I've got you," Sarah whispered over and over, her words breaking between sobs. "I've got you, baby. You're safe. You're safe." Emily clung to her, crying freely now, the kind of crying that only comes when the danger is truly gone. Shadow pressed against both of them, whining softly, his body trembling from exhaustion and relief. Nearby, a medic approached Mason. "Sir, we need to treat that wound before you pass out." "I'm fine," he muttered. "You're bleeding through your uniform," the medic countered. Mason looked down at the dark stain spreading across his sleeve and sighed. "Fine. Tend to the kid first." The medic gave him a look but obeyed, kneeling beside Emily to check her pulse and inspect the rope burns on her wrists. "She's lucky," the medic murmured. "Bruised and dehydrated, but strong." Sarah held Emily tighter, whispering, "Thank you, God," over and over. Delgado stepped closer to Mason, lowering his voice. "We'll need a full statement. This ties directly to the arms case. Roe was our missing link. You've done more than just rescue a civilian." Mason didn't answer right away. His eyes followed the mother and daughter as they clung to each other. "It wasn't just me," he said quietly. "She was the reason any of us are alive to begin with." Delgado nodded. "And that dog?" Mason smiled faintly. "Especially that dog." 10 minutes later, the warehouse was emptying. The suspects were gone, the sirens fading into the distance. The night air had turned cold again, carrying the faint metallic scent of blood and dust. Mason sat on a crate just outside the entrance while a medic wrapped his shoulder in clean gauze. Delgado stood nearby, talking quietly into a radio. Emily, now sitting on the back bumper of the ambulance, looked over at Mason. She slipped down from the step and crossed the short distance between them. "You shouldn't be moving," Sarah called gently after her, but didn't stop her. Emily reached Mason's side, her small hand clutching the metal tag that had once been hidden in her pocket, the one with Shadow's name engraved across it. She held it up. "This helped him find me." Mason smiled tiredly. "Then I'd say it did its job." Her gaze dropped to the blood seeping through his bandage. "Why did you do that? You could've." He stopped her with a soft chuckle. "Hey, you ran into a dark alley to help people you didn't even know. You didn't think twice. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." She frowned slightly. "But you got hurt. That's what happens sometimes when you're protecting someone worth it." Emily's eyes shimmered with fresh tears, and before he could say another word, she threw her arms around his uninjured side. He hesitated, then hugged her back carefully, resting his chin lightly on her hair. Delgado turned away, giving them privacy. A quiet smile ghosted over his face. "We'll get them all," he said softly. "You've given us the proof we needed. This ends here." Mason nodded once. "Let's hope so." At his feet, Shadow finally allowed himself to lie down, curling into a half-circle beside Mason's boots. His breathing was steady, but his eyes never left Emily. The chaos had ended, but the dog's duty had not. Hours later, as the convoy returned to Camp Wilcox, Emily sat in the back seat of an SUV with her mother beside her and Shadow's head resting on her lap. Her fingers traced the edges of the metal tag she still held tight. It was bent now, scratched and covered in grime, but the engraved name still shone beneath the dust. She smiled faintly, whispering, "You found me." Shadow's tail thumped once against the seat, and he leaned closer, pressing his warm muzzle against her shoulder. Outside the window, the horizon was beginning to pale, the first light of dawn stretching across the desert hills. Behind them, the town of Elmage was quiet again, but something within its people, and within Emily, had changed forever. The sun rose slow and golden over Elmage, spilling light across the sandstone ridges and the quiet streets that had once held nothing but dust and silence. But that morning, something new shimmered on the northern edge of town, a place that hadn't existed a year ago. A large hand-painted sign swayed gently in the desert breeze. Emily and Shadow Hope Center. The building behind it was a blend of warm red brick and sleek steel, modern yet soft around the edges. Rows of desert marigolds and lavender framed the walkway leading to wide glass doors. Inside, fresh paint filled the air with the scent of new beginnings. Where there had once been an abandoned shipping yard now stood a sanctuary, part K-9 training facility, part children's outreach center, built for those who had nowhere else to go. This was the town's heartbeat reborn. And standing at its entrance, dressed in a simple white dress with yellow stripes and a nervous smile, was Emily Carter. She was 13 now, a little taller, her hair neatly braided over one shoulder. At her side, as always, stood Shadow, his coat gleaming, a blue silk bandana tied proudly around his neck, and a small honorary badge clipped to his collar that read K-9 Instructor. He looked regal, wise, and still every bit the protector he'd always been. Behind Emily stood her mother, Sarah Carter, graceful in a light gray blouse and tailored slacks. Her eyes glimmered with quiet pride as she watched her daughter take in the crowd that had gathered. Dozens of chairs had been set up in neat rows, filled with townsfolk, soldiers, teachers, and children. Balloons fluttered against the morning light, and the faint hum of a local brass band floated through the air. At the microphone stood Sergeant Mason Reed, dressed in his formal Marine uniform, his left arm now free of the sling but the faint scar still visible beneath his sleeve. The man who had once nearly died in a dark alley now looked stronger, steadier, and, for the first time in years, at peace. Beside him, Mayor Harold Granger cleared his throat, his voice booming warmly across the courtyard. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his mustache twitching with emotion, "I've lived in this town for 40 years. I've seen droughts, storms, and the worst kind of silence. But never have I seen courage like I did the night a 12-year-old girl and her dog refused to walk away." The crowd erupted in applause. Emily blushed, lowering her gaze. Shadow wagged his tail once and barked proudly, earning laughter from the audience. Mayor Granger smiled. "Thanks to the combined efforts of Sergeant Mason Reed, our partners at Fort Clearwater, and the generosity of countless donors, we stand here today to open the Emily and Shadow Hope Center, a place that will train rescue dogs, give homes to strays, and, most importantly, offer a safe haven for children who need a second chance." He paused, emotion tightening his voice. "Because courage isn't something you're born with. It's something that grows when the world asks you to be more than you think you can be." Applause rose again, echoing against the hills. The mayor stepped aside and gestured to Emily. "And now, the girl who started it all." Emily hesitated only a moment before walking to the microphone, her heart thudding in her chest. Shadow followed at her heel, head high, his tag glinting in the sun. She looked out at the sea of faces, neighbors, Marines, classmates, even a few children already enrolled in the center. She took a shaky breath and began. "I don't really like speaking in front of people," she admitted, and the crowd chuckled gently. "But I wanted to say something. I didn't save anyone by myself. I'm not special. I just heard someone who needed help." Her hand drifted down to Shadow's head. "He did the brave part. He never left me, not when it was dark, not when I was scared, not even when I thought it was over. So this place, it's for kids like me. And for dogs like him." Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. Sometimes people need someone who won't give up on them. And sometimes, that someone has 4 legs. There was a collective hush before the courtyard erupted into applause, loud, sustained, genuine. Mason stepped up beside her, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. Together, they lifted a pair of golden scissors and cut the red ribbon stretched across the doors. The crowd cheered as the ribbon fluttered to the ground. Shadow barked once, sharp, confident, and the sound echoed through the courtyard like a battle cry turned into a hymn. Later that afternoon, as the ceremony wound down, guests wandered through the new center, exploring classrooms filled with bright murals, fenced play areas for dogs, and training yards lined with obstacle courses. Emily led a small group of children through the outdoor yard, introducing them to the animals. "This is Biscuit," she said, pointing to a golden retriever with one floppy ear who bounded after a tennis ball. "He's really fast, but not great at sharing." The kids laughed. "And this," she added, nodding to a smaller mutt sitting patiently beside a young boy, "is Maple. She's shy, but she's learning." Shadow stayed at Emily's side, occasionally nudging her hand as if to remind her he was still there, still watching over her, even among new friends. Across the courtyard, Mason stood speaking with Captain Riley Nguyen, now assigned as liaison for the center's military outreach program. "I've read your after-action report," Riley said, her tone a mix of professionalism and warmth. "You could have gone back to active field duty. Instead, you built this." Mason glanced toward Emily, who was laughing with a group of children, Shadow trotting between them like an old guardian. "It wasn't about me," he said quietly. "It was about finishing what she started." Riley smiled, extending her hand. "Well, Sergeant, if you ever decide to expand this to other bases, you'll have my full support. The world could use more places like this." "Appreciate that, Captain," Mason said with a nod. Meanwhile, Sarah Carter sat on a bench under a mesquite tree, watching her daughter. The desert breeze played with her hair as she leaned back, eyes soft with a kind of peace she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for danger, she was simply living in a moment where everything was safe. Her daughter was laughing, the town was healing, and something good had finally come from something terrible. She whispered a silent prayer of thanks and smiled at the sight of Emily tossing a ball for Shadow, who caught it mid-air with effortless precision. That evening, as the last guests left and the courtyard grew quiet, Emily stood in the center of the training yard. The sky above was deep indigo, stars beginning to shimmer through the desert dusk. Shadow sat beside her, panting softly, his tail swaying against the gravel. Emily looked up at the sky. "We did it," she whispered. "But I think we're just getting started." Shadow let out a soft grunt, half bark, half sigh, and leaned against her leg. She smiled, scratching behind his ear. "Yeah, I know. You'll be in charge, like always." A warm breeze swept across the field, carrying the faint scent of sage and marigold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, not in warning this time, but in harmony with the quiet peace that had finally settled over Elmich. Emily took one last look at the glowing sign, Emily and Shadow Hope Center, then turned toward the building, the dog close at her heel. Sometimes miracles don't descend from the clouds. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a child's courage and a dog's unwavering loyalty. Emily and Shadow had shown a town, and perhaps the world, that light can still break through even the darkest alley, carried not by wings, but by paw prints and small, steadfast hearts. Because God doesn't always speak through thunder. Sometimes, he whispers through the ones who simply refuse to give up. And somewhere under that vast New Mexico sky, a girl and her dog walked home, side by side, living proof that miracles still walk among us.